Welcome back to Twisted Tales, the channel where we unravel the darkest threads of human nature. Tonight, we delve into a story that proves the old adage: money is the root of all evil. Imagine a love story so grand it graced the covers of magazines. A power couple with a seemingly unbreakable bond and a fortune beyond measure. But what happens when that love sours, and the glitter of gold becomes more alluring than a human life? What you're about to hear is a chilling account of greed, betrayal, and a deadly scheme that almost went unnoticed. Before we uncover the shocking details, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive champagne hung heavy in the air, a signature fragrance of the Sterling estate. From the sprawling marble terrace, one could see the entire glittering expanse of Los Angeles, a city of dreams that, for Alara and Julian Sterling, was a conquered kingdom. To the outside world, they were the epitome of success. Julian, a tech magnate whose innovations had revolutionized global communication, was a man of sharp intellect and even sharper business acumen. His face, a handsome roadmap of laugh lines and intense focus, was a regular feature in Forbes and Time. And beside him always was Alara. Alara was not merely a billionaire's wife. She was an architect of their public image. With cascading raven hair, eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a grace that seemed almost ethereal, she was the soft power to Julian's overt strength. She chaired charities, curated art collections that critics lauded, and hosted soirees that were the envy of the social elite. Their love story was a modern fairy tale. The brilliant, self-made man and the stunning, cultured woman who had captured his heart. They had met at a gallery opening, a chance encounter that felt like destiny. He was captivated by her knowledge of postmodernism. She was drawn to his quiet intensity. A whirlwind romance culminated in a wedding so lavish it was dubbed the event of the decade. For 10 years, they had built an empire, not just of wealth, but of an image and impenetrable fortress of perfection. But inside a fortress, even one gilded with gold and studded with diamonds, one can still be a prisoner. The illusion began to fray in the quiet moments, the ones the cameras never captured. It started subtly, a casual, dismissive wave of Julian's hand when Alara shared an idea for a new charity initiative, a preference for the company of his board members over a quiet dinner with her. The nights grew longer, filled with the silence of a king-sized bed that felt like a continent. Julian wasn't cruel in the conventional sense. There were no raised voices, no overt acts of malice. His weapon was far more insidious: indifference. He saw her not as a partner, but as his most prized acquisition. She was the final, perfect piece of his collection, an object to be admired and maintained, but not necessarily engaged with. He would praise her for her beauty at a gala, his hand possessively on the small of her back, the gesture a declaration of ownership. "Isn't she magnificent?" He would boom to his associates, his voice laced with pride. But later, when she tried to discuss the nuances of a political article or a troubling world event, his eyes would glaze over, his attention already back on his phone, on the endlessly scrolling ticker of the stock market. He had loved the idea of her, the chase, the conquest, but the reality of a shared life, of intellectual and emotional intimacy, seemed to bore him. The first seed of a darker thought was planted on a Tuesday. It was their 10th anniversary. Alara had spent weeks planning the perfect evening. A private chef, a string quartet playing the piece from their first date, a rare vintage of wine she had sourced from a reclusive French vineyard. She wore the sapphire necklace he had given her on their first anniversary, its deep blue a stark contrast against her pale skin. She waited and waited. A text message arrived at 9:47 p.m. Stuck in a meeting, something unavoidable came up. Raincheck. There was no apology, no warmth, just a clinical postponement of a milestone. Alara sat alone at the perfectly set table for two, the quartet's melancholic melody echoing in the cavernous dining room. She looked at the two champagne flutes, the single red rose in a crystal vase, and the untouched, exquisite meal. It was in that moment, surrounded by the hollow trappings of her perfect life, that the love she had so carefully nurtured began to curdle into something else. It was a slow, cold burn of resentment. She began to observe him with a new, detached clarity. She watched him at breakfast, his focus entirely on the financial news tablet propped against the salt shaker. She saw the way his eyes lit up not when she entered a room, but when a positive quarterly report did. His passion wasn't for her. It was for the game, the accumulation of wealth, the thrill of the deal, the relentless climb. She had simply become part of the portfolio, a stable, blue-chip asset. And what happens to an asset that no longer performs to expectation? It gets liquidated. The thought, terrifying and thrilling, flickered in the back of her mind. The true catalyst, however, was a document she found by accident. Julian was notoriously private about his personal finances, even with her. Their lives were funded by a generous joint account, but the bulk of his empire, the staggering $5 billion, was tied up in a complex web of trusts and holding companies. One afternoon, searching for a misplaced earring in his home office, a room she rarely entered, she knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As she gathered them, a single sheet, separate from the rest, caught her eye. It was a draft of an amendment to his will. Her hands trembled as she read the legal jargon. It was clinical, brutal. In the event of his death, the vast majority of his fortune would be funneled into a charitable foundation bearing his name. A foundation to be managed exclusively by his longtime lawyer and his chief financial officer. She, his wife of a decade, would be left with a generous annual stipend. It was enough to maintain her lifestyle, yes, but it was a pittance compared to the whole. She would be a well-kept widow, a footnote in the grand story of Julian Sterling's legacy. But the most damning part was a handwritten note in the margin. In Julian's familiar, sharp script, contingency in case of divorce. Alara to receive standard settlement. Foundation remains primary beneficiary. He was already planning for her obsolescence. Whether by death or divorce, she was being phased out. The man who had vowed to love and cherish her was now, on paper, treating her like a temporary employee whose contract was nearing its end. The fortress walls suddenly felt like they were closing in, squeezing the very air from her lungs. The gilded cage had become a death row cell. The resentment that had been simmering for months erupted into a cold, calculated rage. It was no longer about a loveless marriage or a dismissive husband. It was about survival. It was about justice in its most twisted form. He had built an empire, but she had been its face, its heart. She had sacrificed her own ambitions, her own identity, to become Mrs. Sterling. And for what? To be discarded like a last season's handbag? No, she wouldn't let that happen. The idea, once a fleeting, dark fantasy, began to take solid form. It was a terrifying, audacious thought, but the more she considered it, the more logical it seemed. A divorce would be messy, public. It would be a battle against Julian's army of ruthless lawyers, and she would walk away with a pre-negotiated, insulting fraction of their shared life. His death, however, his death would make her the grieving widow, the tragic, beautiful relic of a great man. Sympathy would pour in from all corners. And with Julian gone, the amended will, which she knew he hadn't yet signed, would be invalid. The previous version, the one she had signed with him years ago, would stand. The one that left her everything. Her mind, once occupied with art auctions and charity galas, became a whirlwind of grim logistics. How does one arrange the death of a man who is constantly surrounded by security, whose every move is scheduled and monitored? It had to be untraceable. It had to look like an accident. A tragic, unfortunate accident that would befall a man who had everything to live for. Her first move was subtle, a masterpiece of digital reconnaissance. She used a new, untraceable laptop purchased with cash from an obscure electronics store in a different city. She used public Wi-Fi and a VPN, routing her connection through a dozen different countries. She delved into the dark corners of the internet, researching poisons that mimic natural cardiac events, untraceable toxins, and methods of inducing fatal allergic reactions. She spent hours reading forums, medical journals, and declassified intelligence manuals. She learned about ricin, derived from castor beans, and the deadly potency of oleander, a beautiful flowering shrub that grew in their own meticulously manicured garden. She began to study Julian's habits with a forensic intensity. She knew he had a minor, almost insignificant allergy to shellfish. He would get a slight rash, nothing more. But what if that allergy could be amplified? What if a substance could be introduced into his system that would trigger a massive, anaphylactic response to something he consumed regularly? It was a thread, a possibility. She also knew he had recently started a new health kick, drinking a custom-blended green smoothie every morning, prepared by their personal chef. Perfect, daily delivery system. Next, she needed a pawn. Someone desperate, someone invisible. And she found him in the most unlikely of places. During one of her charity visits to a downtown soup kitchen, she noticed a man named Leo. He was a former chemist she learned from a brief, casual conversation. He had lost his job, his family, and his home due to a gambling addiction. He was intelligent, articulate, but broken. His eyes held a deep, simmering desperation that Alara recognized, for it mirrored her own, albeit for different reasons. She began to cultivate a relationship with him. She would accidentally run into him near the shelter. She bought him a coffee, then lunch. She listened to his story, feigning sympathy, her mind a cold, whirring machine of calculation. She never mentioned her husband or her wealth. To Leo, she was just Elle, a compassionate volunteer. After a few weeks, she made her move. She presented him with a hypothetical scenario. A friend of hers was in a terrible, abusive relationship. She needed a way out, but a divorce was not an option for complicated reasons. This friend needed something that would cause a severe, but non-lethal illness. Something to incapacitate her abuser, to give her time to escape. She framed it as an act of liberation, of helping a damsel in distress. She offered him money, more money than he had seen in years. $50,000. Enough to get a new start to pay off his debts. Leo was hesitant, his conscience warring with his desperation. But Alara was persuasive. She painted a vivid picture of the friend's suffering, embellishing details, creating a narrative of a brutal, sadistic husband. She played on his own feelings of powerlessness. "You have a skill, Leo," she had said, her voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper over a greasy diner table. "A skill that could save a woman's life. Isn't that a better use for your knowledge than this?" She gestured vaguely at his shabby surroundings. He eventually agreed. The plan was simple. He would synthesize a compound, a refined plant-based alkaloid. It was colorless, odorless, and in small doses, it would act as a powerful histamine agonist. It wouldn't kill on its own, but it would prime the body's immune system, turning a minor allergic sensitivity into a potential fatal anaphylactic shock. He gave her the substance in a small, unmarked vial, along with precise instructions. He took the cash, his hands shaking, and disappeared back into the anonymous squalor of the city. Alara knew she would never see him again. And if she did, he was a disgraced, homeless man whose word meant nothing against hers. Now she had the means. The vial felt cold and heavy in her purse. It was the key to her freedom, the catalyst for her new life. The plan began to crystallize. Julian's annual yachting trip to the Caribbean was in 3 weeks. It was a tradition, a week of seclusion with only a skeleton crew. It was the perfect setting. Away from the prying eyes of the city, away from the constant presence of his corporate entourage. She would administer the compound in his morning smoothie for a few days leading up to the trip, sensitizing his system. Then, on the yacht, far from any immediate medical help, she would arrange for a special celebratory dinner. A dinner featuring his favorite seafood paella, rich with shrimp and lobster, the shellfish he was only mildly allergic to. His body, primed by the compound, would react violently. It would look like a tragic, sudden-onset allergy, a freak accident at sea. Who would suspect the grieving, doting wife? As she stood on the terrace, the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars, Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the sliding door. The woman staring back at her was beautiful, composed, a perfect mask of serenity. But behind the eyes, a storm was gathering. The transition from loving wife to calculating killer had been terrifyingly seamless. She had been playing a part for 10 years, the part of the perfect wife. This was just a new role, the role of the grieving widow. And Alara Sterling was a very, very good actress. The curtain was about to rise on the final act, and she was ready for her performance. The $5 billion performance of a lifetime. The 3 weeks leading up to the Caribbean trip were a masterclass in deception. Alara played the part of the devoted wife with renewed, almost feverish intensity. She attended functions on Julian's arm, her smile never faltering, her eyes sparkling with a carefully manufactured adoration. She suggested new ventures for his company, listened intently to his monologues about market projections, and even feigned interest in his golf scores. To Julian, it was as if a light had been switched back on in their marriage. He became more attentive, more affectionate. He mistook her calculated performance for a renaissance of her love, a fatal misjudgment that would seal his fate. "You seem different lately," he commented one evening, as she adjusted his tie before a charity auction. "Happier. It's good to see. I've just realized how lucky I am," she replied, her voice as smooth as silk, her fingers brushing his lapel. "I decided to stop taking it all for granted." He beamed, a proud, proprietary smile. He saw her renewed affection as a direct result of his own success, another asset appreciating in value. He was oblivious to the cold, meticulous planning that occurred in the quiet hours after he fell asleep. Each night, Alara would retreat to her private bathroom, the one place she was certain was free of any surveillance. There, with the sound of running water to mask any noise, she would study the vial. It contained a clear, innocuous-looking liquid, the instrument of her liberation. The plan began on a Monday, 3 days before their departure. The chef, a portly Frenchman named Antoine, had been with them for years and followed a strict routine. Julian's green smoothie concoction of kale, spinach, spirulina, and various other unpalatable ingredients was prepared at precisely 7 a.m. Antoine would blend it, pour it into a tall glass, and leave it on the marble island in the kitchen for Julian to pick up on his way to his home gym. This 15-minute window was Alara's opportunity. On Monday morning, she feigned a headache, allowing Julian to go downstairs ahead of her. Clad in a silk robe, she descended the grand staircase, her movements silent. She slipped into the pantry adjacent to the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. She heard Antoine place the glass down with a soft clink and then retreat to the staff quarters for his own breakfast. Peeking around the doorframe, she saw it. The tall glass of viscous green liquid. The coast was clear. Her hands, surprisingly steady, opened her small clutch where she had concealed the vial and a sterile eyedropper. She moved swiftly, her bare feet making no sound on the cool limestone floor. A single, precisely measured drop fell into the smoothie. It disappeared instantly, leaving no trace. She stirred it with a long spoon, wiped the spoon clean with a tissue she had brought for the purpose, and slipped back into the pantry. A moment later, Julian entered the kitchen, humming a tune from a commercial he had seen. He picked up the glass, downed it in 3 long gulps, and left it in the sink. He hadn't noticed a thing. Alara repeated the process on Tuesday and Wednesday. Each morning, the single, untraceable drop was added to his morning ritual. Each morning, he consumed it without suspicion. There were no side effects, no changes in his behavior, just as Leo had promised. The compound was silently, insidiously preparing his body for the final assault. It was like winding a watch, each drop a turn of the key, tightening the spring of his immune system until it was ready to snap. They flew to St. Bart's on their private jet, a flying palace of cream leather and polished mahogany. Julian was in high spirits, talking animatedly about a new acquisition, while Alara sipped champagne, her mind a million miles away, rehearsing her role. The yacht, the Serenity, was a breathtaking vessel, a 200-foot marvel of engineering and luxury. its sleek white hull cut through the impossibly blue water, a symbol of the immense wealth that had become the source of her torment and now, her motivation. The first 2 days at sea were idyllic. They swam in turquoise coves, sunbathed on the deck, and enjoyed lavish meals prepared by the yacht's private chef. Alara was the picture of contentment. She laughed at Julian's jokes, rubbed sunscreen on his back, and suggested they watch the sunset together. She was weaving the final threads of her narrative, creating the perfect alibi of a second honeymoon. The skeleton crew, a captain, a first mate, and a chef saw only a couple deeply in love. The night she had chosen was the third night. The weather was perfect, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus. The sky was clear, promising a spectacular display of stars. It was their anniversary, the real one this time. The one Julian had so carelessly dismissed weeks before. The irony was not lost on Alara. "I have a surprise for you tonight," she told him that afternoon, her voice playful. "A special dinner to celebrate. Just the two of us on the upper deck." He was delighted. "You're full of surprises lately," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'm a lucky man." "Yes, you are," she whispered, the words tasting like poison and prophecy. She spoke to the chef, a young, ambitious man named Marco. She requested Julian's favorite, a seafood paella, heavy on the lobster and shrimp. "It's our anniversary," she explained, her eyes misty with feigned sentimentality. "I want everything to be perfect." Marco, eager to please, promised a culinary masterpiece. He was aware of Mr. Sterling's mild shellfish allergy, of course. "Just a skin thing," he says, Marco noted. "He eats it all the time, just takes an antihistamine before if he feels a tingle. I'll have them on hand, just in case." Alara's smile was serene. "Thank you, Marco. You think of everything." It was perfect. His known habit of eating shellfish despite his allergy would only add to the tragic narrative of the accident. He pushed his luck one too many times. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the upper deck was transformed. A single table was set with fine china and crystal, surrounded by flickering candles. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Alara wore a flowing white dress, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She looked every bit the sea goddess, the adoring wife. Julian arrived, dressed in linen trousers and a crisp white shirt, a bottle of Dom Perignon in his hand. "To us," he said, popping the cork. "To the next 10 years. To us," Alara echoed, her crystal flute clinking against his. The sound was like a death knell. They talked and laughed as they ate the first course, a simple caprese salad. Alara kept his glass full, her conversation light and engaging. She was mesmerizing, drawing him in, making him feel like the center of the universe.